Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I've been enjoying these weeks very much. And so the titles of my lectures that you had on your program were very general. So here's a slightly more precise title, but well, I'm going to tell you more in detail what I'm going to talk about in a minute. Just wanted to remind you who I am. It's a very deep question, but I suppose the best way to characterize, well, I suppose if I had to apply for jobs, I would say I'm a philosopher of cognitive science. I have a pretty eclectic background, but I did my first degree in Italy in philosophy, then I went to England in a master in cognitive science, and then I did a PhD, I guess in philosophy, although it was in the Interdisciplinary School of Cognitive Science at Sussex. And then I went and did a postdoc in philosophy, then I did another postdoc in a neuropsychology lab. I didn't really do experiments, but I was exposed to lots of empirical research. I was told, you're a philosopher, you're here, and you have to learn from us, okay? And now I've been in Exeter for 8 years almost in a philosophy department, although an interdisciplinary one, and I guess my work is primarily philosophical. So my main research topics have been, well, when I did my PhD, it was called embodied embedded cognition, and now it's more fancy to call the approach 4E cognition. I think it was Sean who introduced this label. I'm not sure, I bet he's not here. I should have asked him. But so the idea 4E cognition refers to the idea that cognition is embodied, embedded, enactive, and even extended. And there is a debate at the moment on whether all these E's are actually compatible with one another. And in fact, as we will see, you can have varieties of embodied approaches. What embedded means depends on from context to context, so it's a very complex approach altogether. But it is actually really quite booming. So in 2010, the Cambridge published the Cambridge Handbook of Situated Cognition, which is just another term that refers mainly to, say, embedded cognition. Now there is a Routledge Handbook of Embodied Cognition. Sean is now editing, together with someone else, the Oxford Handbook for 4E cognition. So it's really booming, and you will certainly have lots of resources to...
Shouldn't emotion go in there?
Yes. I know. I was thinking 5E cognition. But actually, I'm reluctant to do that because I actually like the term affectivity better. And I'm not going to talk very much about this, but I'm happy to discuss this later. I actually think that a cognition is affective, not necessarily emotional, but yeah, some other time. So anyway, what I've done in my work is basically, so I was exposed to this idea very much during my PhD, but also I had my own, I've always been very interested in emotion, affectivity, that depends on my interest in art and music and life. So what I've done so far in my work is to try to bridge these two domains, so to try to say, well, if we take an embodied or 4E approach to cognition, how do we reconceptualize affectivity? So in my work, including I have a recent book about this, I try to reconceptualize a variety of affective phenomena from an embodied mind perspective. And then also I'm interested in phenomenology in the tradition that Sean was talking about, so the historical tradition that is usually traced back to Husserl, and I'm going to say something very briefly about this and about why it's relevant for embodiment. So I also like to call myself an empirically minded philosopher. So for those of you who are not philosophers, you might encounter very different kinds of philosophers, especially of mind. So there are those who think that you can do philosophy by only doing conceptual analysis. So by reflecting on, what do we mean by mind? What do we mean by the emotion? Well, how do we answer this question? Well, how do we use terms for emotion and mind? So it's very much tied with linguistic analysis. And according to this approach, science doesn't really help you answer those questions because science is an empirical enterprise. It answers this, it deals with different questions, is descriptive. So you think some philosophers think, well, we're doing conceptual analysis, we're not doing anything empirical, and so we don't even need to talk to scientists. Whereas you have other philosophers, philosophers of cognitive science, as they like to call themselves, there's a science word in it, who think that you have to, philosophy needs to listen to science, although also the other way around, philosophy needs to be able to understand science and so also eventually criticize it if that's the case. And I think I want to put myself in that group. So I do think that philosophy and science, well, it's a very complex relation. So there are cases in which philosophers should take data, experimental data, as useful for supporting their own views. But also, I think the job of philosophy is also to feed back and sometimes point out where there are conceptual difficulties in scientific theoretical frameworks or cases in which, the data don't really seem to fit the theory, and perhaps scientists haven't noticed, So anyway. Just before I start, many people have asked me, where is Exeter? So Exeter is here. is a 150,000 people town, and it's almost on the sea, and this is a wonderful part of England. So this is Cornwall, this is known as the English Riviera, so it's lots of wonderful coast, beaches, national parks, rolling green hills. Yeah, I'm very lucky. It's 2.5 hours from London. And so I'm in the sociology, philosophy, and anthropology department, so interdisciplinary department, which is famous, well, in the case of sociology, particularly famous for sociology of arts and culture, and also science and technology studies. And in philosophy, is top department in the UK for philosophy of biology. But now we are actually having an increasing group of people working on embodied and extended cognition. So I was the only one for a while, but now we actually have 4 people. So I'm just advertising this in case of any of you wants to come and visit. It's a nice place to be. This is the cathedral in Exeter, famous for its, has the longest Gothic nave in Gothic cathedral. Okay, so now to the lecture. Okay, so I think the lecture is more or less divided in 2 parts, or they're not going to fit squarely with the first and second hour. And also, I thought I had maybe extra time at the end, so I was adding some slides. Now I'm not going to have that time, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover all of it, but I hope enough. So I'll first introduce the idea of embodied cognition in a very general way, assuming that you know nothing about it. And then I'm going to turn to emotion. And first overview traditional accounts of emotion in psychology, philosophy and affective science. Again, very general. But what I want to do is just tell you how, basically from an embodied cognition perspective, these traditional accounts of emotion are a bit, they are quite unsatisfying. So I will provide a critique of traditional accounts of emotion from an embodied cognition perspective. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to move on to another of the E's of the 4E approach. So I'm going to introduce the idea of extended cognition. And again, then I'm going to turn to emotion. And here really it's going to be mainly asking, so we're going to do a kind of together brainstorming process, ask whether and how emotion can be extended. So maybe I should explain. So I'm going to talk about very generally about embodied cognition without distinguishing embodied, embedded, and active. It's all quite complex. I'm actually not going to talk about enactivism specifically, even if that's what I've worked a lot on. So feel free to ask me later. But so just take this as kind of a general idea that applies to at least the first 3 E's of that term, 4E cognition. Okay, so part 1. As I mentioned, this is a thriving and much debated interdisciplinary research area, so I'm sure I will give you ideas that you will find like, no. So it's very debated, So just a very, I want to place this embodied approach in its historical context, so I'm going to give you an embarrassingly brief history of cognitive science, but you can broadly divide things in the non-embodied approaches and the embodied approaches, where the non-embodied approaches are, if you think of the history of cognitive science, certainly it was originally driven by artificial intelligence and by the creation of the computer, first the theoretical thoughts by Turing about calculation, computation, Turing machines, but then the actual construction of a von Neumann machine. And that really supported what the symbolic approach to in cognitive science. I'm going to just say something more in the next slide. Then in the 80s, you have the emergence of a connectionist approach. And then it's the embodied approach, you can say, it's really becomes more influential from the 90s on, although of course you can always find exceptions and people who said something relevant before that. But if this is a kind of broad framework. And the embodied approach really consists of different lines of argument. So the symbolic approach, basically, if you want to capture in a motto is the idea that the mind is a digital computer. In particular, the relationship between mind and brain is like the one between the software and the hardware of a digital computer. So in this view, cognition is the manipulation of symbolic representations according to internal rules or programs. And a key paper here, if you want to trace back this project, is the paper by Newell, Physical Symbol Systems. So the idea that really cognition is the manipulation of physical symbol systems. Connectionism, well, in the 80s, people started to think, well, wait a minute, the hardware of a digital computer doesn't really look much like the brain. The brain is this incredibly complex piece of matter, which has all these neurons connected together, which processes information in a parallel way. Then we are able to learn, which the previous models didn't seem to be able to do. So there was this more biologically inspired approach where people thought that, well, we should think of cognition as being something like, well, cognitive states, say, as patterns of activation of neural networks. Well, mainly artificial neural networks, very simplified ones. But the idea being that, well, the brain is a bit like that. It's just much more complex. But whenever you have a cognitive states, it means it's activating a series of neurons interconnecting among each other. And the patterns of change that make up cognitive processes depend on input and on previous activity of the network. So importantly, these neural networks, they were able to learn and they would change the connection between neurons depending on previous inputs. So this was all meant to be, okay, this looks more like how we are rather than a digital computer. And the Bible of this approach, as you might know, is Rumelhart and McClelland's parallel distributed processing, 2 volumes. And of course, this approach has then developed, and we've heard talks that refer to neural networks and has become much more complex. But so let me say why these approaches are non-embodied from those who defend an embodied approach. Well, the point is that, okay, so important, I wrote this here. So they're not disembodied in a Cartesian sense. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Descartes. How many have? Don't be embarrassed. So some have not. So René Descartes, I don't remember if it's spelled like that, but so Descartes was a philosopher in 17th century philosopher, really crucial for Western philosophical thought. And he's famous for dividing the world into 2 substances, the so-called thinking substance and the extended substance, also known as the mind and the body. So this might be a bit confusing because you're thinking body like body. No, what he meant is soul, if you want, the stuff that does the thinking, and matter. So for Descartes, I am composed of 2 substances. I am a physical entity, and my brain is a physical entity, my body is a physical entity, and that can be studied like any other object, physical object in the world. But also the fact that I'm able to tell you now, that I'm able to think, that I reason, depends on the fact that I am also a thinking substance. In fact, I am the conjunction of the thinking substance and the material substance. And this thinking substance is connected to this via a part of the brain. So this is known as Cartesian dualism. And I'm saying this, now I'm going to have to say something because my English students, first-year student, confuse this. So it's Cartesian dualism refers to Descartes dualism, and that's because Descartes in Latin is called Cartesius. Some people don't know. So Cartesian dualism. So it's not that the symbolic and the connectionist system are disembodied in the sense that they think that cognition is this thinking substance, that it's not material in any way. So that's not the sense in which I'm going to talk about the connectionist and the symbolic system as being non-embodied, okay? And that's because, well, I think it's fair to say that most cognitive scientists today are materialist. So they think that mind is somehow material. So this view is generally regarded as silly, not something that we should reject. In fact, you would say cognitive science is a whole attempt to reject this view. And now, of course, there are debates on whether that's the case, and there are some people who still defend dualism. It's all very complicated. But so what I'm going to talk today are all materialistic approaches. And so symbolic and connectionist approaches are materialist in some sense. So they do think that cognition depends on, well, the hardware of a computer. Maybe it can actually be reduced to what the hardware of a computer does. Or the connectionist approach thinks, cognition is this process that refers to how patterns of activation of the nervous system change. But why do I call them non-embodied? Because they still place cognition here and kind of think that you can somehow divide this from the rest of the organism. And the rest of the organism, the body, is not really cognitive, is not smart, is not intelligent. So in my terminology here, it might be helpful. Remember, I'm going to talk about the body as basically the organism minus the brain. So in the way I'm going to talk about, I think brain plus rest of the body, so brain plus body equals organism. So when I talk about the body, I mean the whole organism minus the brain. So according to symbolic and connectionist approaches, the body, in the sense of the organism minus the brain, is something that, while only provides inputs to the cognitive system and then receives outputs from it, but all the smart stuff is done by the brain. So cognition is centralized. So cognition is like the pilot in its ship. And I wanted to ask you, because this is a very famous anime in Italy in the 80s. I had a crush on Captain Harlock. But I don't know, do you know this? It was Japanese 70s anime. Who has seen this? Can I? Okay, the non-Japanese people, interesting. Anyway, so, yes, that's why. Well, I wasn't, but you know, it went on for some time. Anyway, so let me just try to characterize this in more detail. So according to the symbolic approach, you have the body, which may at most provides sensory input into the central system, which then, forms perceptual, representations. We've heard a lot about those. And then there are some kind of rules that apply that manipulate these representations, provide other representations, which perhaps specify how the body should move. And this then provides action. So the body is external or extrinsic to cognition on this approach. And connectionist approach is not that different. I mean, obviously, the idea of how matter realizes cognition is quite different, but the body is still extrinsic to cognition. So now enters the embodied approach in the 1990s, when many people started to emphasize that there is a very close interconnection between brain, body, and even world. So cognition on this approach is not regarded anymore as brain-bound. So it's not seen anymore as just linked to the brain. Or if you want, I think a better way to put it, the brain is not seen anymore as the necessary and sufficient basis for cognition. It's not seen as the supervenience basis for cognition. Rather, and this is a kind of motto that you find in many embodied approaches, cognition is realized by complex patterns of interactivity between brain, body, and world. Sometimes there is talk of emergence. Lots of debate about what emergence means. I like also I think this is quite a nice way of putting it. The idea is that cognition is distributed over brain, body, and even world. So
will you define what you mean by cognition?
Well, I'm going to give you some examples of how embodied approaches think that you should do cognitive science, which should start to give a sense of what they mean by cognition. But then, of course, one criticism would be, well, you're not really doing cognitive science, or you're not really providing models of cognition. So, I mean, if you ask me so I suppose here the idea would be that, cognition is what the other guy also meant. So it refers to all sorts of processes that enable us to acquire knowledge. So it doesn't require consciousness necessarily. So, learning, memory, perception, this is cognition. And I think this is quite shared among all cognitive scientists, including embodiment ones. You happy with that?
Yeah. I wasn't so clear about to what extent you include and not include. Like, if you mentioned that it's not necessarily conscious. Consciously perceived, like some kind of complicated computation performed unconsciously. That's also a part of the cognition.
Yeah, it depends. See, I would think that depends on the context. So if you are studying that process in the context of an organism that displays some kind of intelligent behavior, then that's called cognition.
Okay.
But I mean, this is, it's really at the core also philosophical debates in cognitive science, because these approaches have, mainly an information processing view of cognition, whereas some embodiment say, no, where is the information? What do you mean by information? So it's really quite a huge question.
With this approach, do you try, or is it necessary to keep the idea of an individual at all?
With which approach?
Well, I mean, in the sense that if cognition is being offloaded to the world, then in principle, you know, you're part of the world, he's part of the world. So if I'm offloading cognition onto him, do you actually need to hold on to the idea of an individual to do that?
Okay, so first, I haven't still yet gone into the embodied approach. Now, this is a very important question. I'm going to get to there when I talk about the extended mind. But that's definitely an issue of where you draw the boundary. Once you start to think that interrelation is really quite crucial to say that the boundaries of cognition are not just don't stop at the brain, then the point is, well, where do they stop? Do they stop anywhere? I think, you know, for the embodied approach, you can quite safely say that the idea is that, well, it kind of stays, you know, within the boundaries of the skin in the case of organisms that have the skin, but it's, you know, it's not settled. The issue is not settled at all.